provocateur.media.
Something that is transcendent or cosmic or beyond physics, metaphysics. That's what we're really talking about. So I want to ask you, Mom, this because I'm not even sure what the answer is. You know, you're my mom.
Ask away.
I know you, I think. Is there anything that you worship, anything that you find sacred? Are you humbled by something?
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome back to the Goldwaters. This episode is all about spirituality and religion. I'm your moderator, Dan Delmar. Hello, Goldwaters.
Hey, Dan.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, Dan.
How are we all today?
Very well, thank you. And you?
Excellent. So, in previous episodes, we did touch on religion a lot, on spirituality. So we thought let's devote a whole episode to this. We'll talk about atheism versus agnosticism, cults as well. Perhaps we'll get back to meditation talk that came up on the happiness episode, I believe. So one of the ways of looking at spirituality through the lens of religion is through ethics and morality. That these are at the core of many religions, but can you live a moral life without being religious? Can you be religious and not moral? We'll start there, really. Why don't we just try to define what is religion to you guys?
I think religion had its place as a civilizing force as people learned to live together in ever larger groups, right? You know, when you started from the original group, which is the family, and humans or humanids, like early humans, lived together in small groups of a few families together to have a unifying force that would start bringing larger groups together where you might not know who Joe or Susie are, knowing that their shared beliefs permitted a cohesiveness and permitted the development of a social peace. So I see it as a socializing force, you know, for humans at a certain level of civilization, a certain level of education, but absolutely unnecessary in the modern era. I know that sounds funny because I remember being taught in high school that communism was a step along the path to civilization, which was represented by capitalism. So maybe I'm echoing the teachings of my youth. But at the end of the day, I can't imagine a more counterproductive force in the modern world.
But wait, just because it's unnecessary doesn't mean that it's not enjoyable or productive. I mean, a lot of things are unnecessary, Mom. I mean, I can go without, carbs for a good long time, and it's not going to be very pleasant. Or the reality is that many people still continue to engage in religion. People of all different walks of life and different socioeconomic strata, people continue to engage in religious rituals, religious communal living, and religious psychology, and it brings them a lot of happiness and joy, and modernity is not torn asunder, and no one's sacrificing children to animal gods, and people carry on, and it gives them happiness. So I don't see...
Well, I might take exception to that when I consider the parts of the world today in modernity where abortion is refused to even to children who have been raped. I have to tell you, I think children are still being sacrificed literally at the altar of religious belief.
Yeah, and science produced atom bombs. Yes, there are horrible things done in the name of religion, but to say root and stick religion should be banished and produces no good, I think is a stretch.
I never said it should be banished.
Unnecessary, causes harm.
Unnecessary, counterproductive to the values of civilization that are today framed without reference to the great monkey man in the sky. Or whatever your flavor du jour is, please, that is my irreverent reference to whatever it is you believe in, you, the wonderful listener, because otherwise if I name somebody's God, I'm sure to be offending that person. So I have a generic reference.
Our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the preamble makes reference to God, by the way. When you're speaking about, and I'm not even going for the United States, which is too easy as a choice to go to, but when you say that modern states or modern law, or what you're suggesting, does modern society does not make reference to these things, I disagree.
I have two short answers for that. First of all, there's an awesome judgment out there that talks about the reference to God in the preamble to the Canadian Charter, and it says it's that reference that permits people of different religious beliefs to cohabit peacefully, because it underscores the fact that society itself, in Canada at least, is not adopting any particular religion, but recognizes there's an abstraction called God that animates many Canadian citizens, and that the state is recognizing that and considering that part of Canadians' freedom. The flip argument is also used by the British, who happen to have a state religion, and they have a state religion, and they are quite droll about it, because in fact that's why for the Brits religion is even of lesser importance.
Let me depoliticize this a bit and turn to Samantha and ask you, Samantha, what are some of the benefits psychologically when it comes to religion and spirituality, and do you make a distinction between the two?
I think that, one thing that's really important that I don't think we've actually even touched on is even a real answer to your first question, Dan. What is religion? We spoke about it as a vestigial tale. Last I checked, it's not something that's physically attached to us or that's hanging out our backsides. A religion on its simplest level is a certain moral code to live by and certain rituals, on the most part, on how to follow that. And it's organized in some way, manner, shape, or form. Does it have any benefits? Well, in terms of the research generally shows that people who are religious and participate in that do have greater senses of well-being and may have greater senses of community as well. Now, whether it's necessary to achieve those ends, well, we'll see. That depends. But the facts is that for people that are religious, they do tend to experience these benefits. And then to touch on your previous point where we're getting into, is religion necessary for ethics or for morality? Frankly, I don't think it really has anything to do with it one way or another. I think that there's been plenty of moral and wonderful things that have been done in the name of religion and also in the name of secularism, just as I think there have been some heinous and immoral and terrible things done in the name of religion as well as in secularism. So I just don't see that one begets the other necessarily.
The reason I referred to religion as a sort of vestigial tale is because for all of us, we imbibe religion along with our mother's milk. Your religious beliefs, your sense of your religious identity, whether you're actually practicing your religion or not, comes in early infancy and childhood, because you are the values your parents espouse are transmitted to you, and those religious values are transmitted before political values are necessarily.
As are all other values.
But there's a difference, because in my experience, and it's my experience as an attorney, admittedly, people can accept or reject their parents' political values or attitudes towards money or prejudices a lot more easily than they can reject the religious values that have been inculcated. Again, I emphasize from infancy: circumcision, baptism, confirmation, communion.
The intensity of that inculcation, I think, is the issue. There are certainly many people who convert or who find God in a certain religion late in life and at different points, and find many different gods along their lifetime. So I take your point. Yes, it's part of the mother's milk, but to Samantha's point, I mean, all culture is, if anything, I would think more fundamental secular laws that you grow up with and that you become acquainted with that really true govern your safety might be harder to change or to shed than religiosity.
Well, I think a lot of that might be because you're children of quite a secular society here in Montreal and in Canada. When we were growing up, people of my generation, when we were growing up, moral values and good behavior and good citizenship were defined through the prism of religious belief. There was such a thing as Bible readings and Sunday school, or I went to Jewish school on Sunday mornings. So when I say Sunday school, I don't necessarily mean Christian Sunday school. And that's where the concept of values came from. You kids, just as I, went to conventional Protestant public schools where the religious content, certainly in your generation, was nil. Because for me, talking about religion in modernity in the year 2017 is like talking about phrenology or alchemy. It is like talking about hieroglyphics, of historic interest, but of what utility today. It's like talking about printing presses to generate a newspaper. Again, there's a historic interest.
But that's why
and it doesn't make me insensitive to people who operated printing presses and earned a living and were displaced when the industry came to an end. So I have no difficulty, and I think between the three of us, I'm probably the one who has defended the most in our family discussions the idea that you have to let people be, and you have to let them entertain their irrational beliefs. And as long as those irrational beliefs are not causing harm, like the types of parents who refuse to vaccinate their children, there's an irrational belief that causes harm. But otherwise, for people who feel a necessity to light candles and pray and worship, so nothing changes. I'm more worried about the people who worship doubtful leaders like Marie Le Pen. That's what worries me. I worry about people who worship cult leaders who are taking them down a road to harm. That worries me. But the level of civilization that religion had already attained some time ago, which was to worship abstractions or to worship long dead historical figures, causes no harm. It gives people some inner peace. It seems that its greatest social utility are for people who'd otherwise feel a terrible existential despair when they get to middle age and recognize that life is finite.
Well, and I think that's something that I'm glad that you actually finally got to that people who are religious do experience certain benefits and on the most part cause very little harm just by virtue of their beliefs. I just think that and that's why I think it puts it in a different category than something like phrenology. And I don't think those are fair analogies because you're comparing it to, or the printing press or something, because you're talking about it as a sort of outdated technology. And religion has various different purposes. If we're going to see religion as a system of knowing, like a way to know the truths about the world, maybe not the best system. If we're going to talk about it as a way to attain higher morality or ethics, so. Depends how you interpret the doctrine in there and what aspects you choose to actually follow and take seriously in the religion. Now, if you're talking about religion, on the other hand, as a way to have a sense of connection, as a way to have a certain feeling of transcendence and connection with your history and with the universe and a sense of life not being finite, then these could be great sources of solace.
But I want to point out to you, Samantha, and maybe unwittingly and with good intentions, what you're doing, in fact, is entering into the domain of religious belief and starting to judge it. This much and this kind of religious belief is okay, and the rest not so much. That's what you're saying. I'm saying leave it alone, but the reason I'm more candid than you and point out that it's counterproductive is because humans are very, very funny creatures. They rarely keep their belief systems to themselves, and then they brandish these belief systems to cause harm. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Crusades. Maybe you have to, stretch a little bit historically to find when Christians systematically did harm to others, but they did. And I don't have to go that far back in history to remind you of the times in history in Western Europe where Protestants and Catholics considered each other heretics for different reasons, and blood was spilled in the name of that difference.
Now, let me just say, religion does not have the monopoly on harm.
Yeah, or bigotry or intolerance.
Bigotry.
I mean, for heaven's sake.
It's just absurd. Humans, maybe, have
communism, plenty of secular movements. I mean,
fascism. Like, there's a lot of secular movements that have caused
many genocides in the name of secular ideologies. It's not really.
Why don't I turn it the other way?
If people want to find reasons to be able to harm each other or to do things in their interest and over the rights of other people, they'll figure it out, whether through religion or through secularism or through whatever.
But to make it more distinct, though, and to try to frame the discussion, I think what distinguishes it is the mystical, or what Mom might be calling the irrational, something that is transcendent or cosmic or beyond physics, metaphysics. That's what we're really talking about. I noticed, Samantha, early on in your definition, you're talking about a group of people with certain beliefs, but you omitted that essential part.
It's a good point.
And so I want to ask you, Mom, this, because I'm not even sure what the answer is. You're my mom.
Ask away.
I know you, I think. Is there anything that you worship, anything that you find sacred? Are you humbled by something higher and more mystical?
I'm humbled by the fact that I brought two souls into the world. conscious souls who with originality of thought and belief, and that in essence I created something out of nothing. And I'm making a point because we hearken to what physicists tell us about the Big Bang, that ostensibly you started with nothing or an elemental particle.
Or Dad was the Big Bang.
Oh, Daniel, you had to go there. Oh, you had to go there.
It's too easy. It was too easy.
He sure was. He sure was.
Okay.
Your dad
now
is
don't.
awesome.
All right,
in
now
bed.
don't salivate over it. Okay.
Great.
All
I
right.
still think he's hot, and he's
Okay.
71.
My ears,
Now
they
that-
burn. They burn.
So there was
Please, dear
there was
God.
a Big
Please, dear
Bang,
God,
and
stop.
Samantha
And you were born.
and we were born. But I just wanted to know it's very heartening, it's poetic, and all those things. But to go back to rationality, Ma, we're just a collection of atoms, and there was
electrons.
some fertile juices going on, and we were made, and we're going to die, and we're going to have maybe other fertile
And when
juices.
we die, consciousness will come to an end, and there is nothing else.
Okay, but I don't think you really answered my question. Again, there's a beauty in what you said, but that was still an act that you performed, making us. And I'm asking about something really external, something that has nothing to do with you.
I hate to say it all comes from science fiction, but it all comes from science fiction. Stranger in a Strange Land, Robert A. Heinlein, the late, great Robert A. Heinlein. I am God, you are God. Because when we bring life into being, we are engaging in that elemental task that we otherwise ascribe to the abstraction called God, but we do that. And I think uniquely, I think many of our fellow animals do this. I mean, it is the essence of life to create more life, to reproduce, expand, and grow. I think consciousness is an inevitable consequence of the increasing complexity and diversity of life. And I think we, like other living beings, create tools and build, but we are at the summit of existence in terms of our ability to create something out of nothing, to build airplanes and buildings and subway cars. And I think that is the abstraction and the spirituality that I need. And I don't look at a beautiful church, a church that may be architecturally beautiful, and feel a greater sense of divinity and worship than I do when I look at, or when I used to look at, the World Trade Center. Or let's make it more mundane, when I looked at Place Ville-Marie here in Montreal.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to invoke one thing, and, excuse me if it's a little painful, but it's for a purpose. When Rocco, one of our first family dogs, passed away, we had a ceremony for him, did we not?
We sure did.
We buried him in our backyard, and
We sure did.
we invited members of our community, and if I recall, you had even said a prayer, right? You had printed out...
The 23rd Psalm.
Okay, so I just want to point out that sometimes...
I'm a hypocrite? So what else is new? Did you just figure that out?
I want the listeners to know that you're a hypocrite.
Let me jump in here because I think there are a lot of listeners that hear that you guys have some connection to Judaism, to the Jewish community. What parts do you take from Judaism and what parts do you sort of leave to the side?
Well, if I flip it on its head, I would say absolutely everything. There was no question that in the days where I was learning my civil code, never mind my criminal code, I had enough of a theological education to recognize that when we say that our legal systems in the Occidental world are based on Judeo-Christian values, it is very, very literal. And as a matter of fact, I've often touched on the intersection of those domains because I've had cases involving religious observance in the secular world, like the Jewish divorce case that went to the Supreme Court. And it was amazing the extent to which ancient texts of Jewish law corresponded word to word to where our civil code was, let's say, up till about 1981. The original civil code as it prevailed at the time of Confederation, which in fact dated to 1866, our code, was chapter and verse in terms of definition of what is a legitimate child and rules of inheritance and so on, could have easily been copied from ancient Jewish texts. And the variance between the civil laws and criminal laws in modernity, so that means, let's say, in the last 30, 40 years, has come as society has stepped away from this lockstep adherence to religious precept, which is why in modernity we have rules about gay marriage and about single-parent filiation or filiation of gay and lesbian parents to their children. the equality of the value of the testimony of a woman to a man and a man to a woman, rules about sexual assault. A husband no longer has an absolute right to sex with his wife. These are the rules of modernity as we've stepped away from following Judeo-Christian values.
Samantha, are there aspects to your identity that are rooted in the Jewish religion?
That's a great question. Yes, that's the simple answer, but much more in terms of Judaism qua culture and ethnicity than religion. I've always identified as Jewish, and for me, history and family and bloodlines have always had a very special significance for me. It's maybe been my way of dealing with issues of immortality, of saying that, you know, there's this line and there's people and there's my family, and, you know, we've always been there and we'll keep on going. In terms of the actual, you know, belief in God or the precepts of Judaism as a religion, it's something that I struggled slightly with growing up, but it didn't. You know, growing up, I identified as agnostic. And I just saw it as, well, there isn't evidence one way or the other whether God exists. And so, you know, we'll wait and see. I'm an empiricist. We'll wait and see. And then over time, the more attention that I gave to the issue and the more I studied it and discussed it and debated it with, you know, with my dad, with Daniel, with my brother, with mom, and the more I thought about it, it occurred to me that there wasn't really any evidence that I could fathom that would convince me that there was a God, that something called God could actually exist in any way, manner, shape, or form. And from there, I identified as an atheist and have continued to identify as an atheist. So, you know, I guess I come from the long and noble tradition of atheist, secular Jews, but that's where I'm at. So I am Jewish. I strongly identify with that. But in terms of the actual, there are little bits and pieces of the religion that I identify with, and with the practice that I think are lovely. But it's not something that I personally identify with, the religious aspect specifically.
So picking up from that, let's talk about two groups of people who could be spiritual in some ways, but who largely reject organized religion: atheists and agnostics. Do you consider yourselves part of either group? And do you consider that there's a tremendous difference between both, or are both just sort of debating, I suppose, the finer points of what is beyond what we know life to be?
I used to identify as an atheist. I no longer. I like to think of myself, I suppose, as post-atheist, in that it still echoes inside me. I think I still have a deep-rooted skepticism towards notions of a higher power, but I don't identify as an atheist anymore, in that I find that I can retreat into my consciousness sometimes and really cast my mind to faraway places and reel it back in and at different speeds. And I find that to me invokes spiritual feeling. I find that I can really use my brain, my mind, to escape reality and to feel something really deep and profound and transcendent. And there's no need to try to fit it into a belief system. Sometimes I feel atheist, sometimes I feel theist, sometimes I feel agnostic. And I find to have a label that is static, it starts to disappear. It's sort of like magic. Once you see a magic trick many times, it stops feeling magic. It's how new the sensory input is how deep the feeling is.
If you asked me to put a label on it, I would put a label of atheist, for the simple reason that I take that expression as being very literal, meaning the absence of theism. And I wouldn't call myself agnostic, because an agnostic is still asking himself the question. I don't have that question.
Personally, I'm an atheist. I don't believe that there is a God. I can't, as I mentioned before, I don't see that there's any evidence that can compel me otherwise. But to me, it's no big deal one way or the other. And for people that believe in it, then that's great, as long as they're not harming anyone. And to touch on Daniel's point, and to go back to your point, Mom, I don't think that everything needs to be rational. I think that there's a lot of experiences that we have that are connecting, that are transcendent, that are beautiful, that can feel mystical and take you out of your present. And I think that those are lovely and wonderful experiences that can be accepted just on their face, and that we can just enjoy and be in them and in the moment. And I don't think that those are an escape. If anything, I think that those are paying attention and fully immersing ourselves in the beauty and the wonder that surrounds us.
Let's talk about God. Samantha, what is God to you?
God to me is, when I think of God, I think of an immaterial, invisible, omnipresent being of sorts who has consciousness and who has some sort of say in world affairs and in the affairs of humans. And God defined thus, I don't believe in any more than I believe in than I believe in the boogeyman. But that said, if people believe in that, then that's wonderful and that's great. And if people find solace and transcendence and connection with that, and then, hey, why not?
Daniel?
Something beyond my understanding.
Listen, there's no grand unified theory yet beyond, we haven't gone much further than what Einstein discovered. There's still inexplicable elements to quantum physics. There's a question, is it true that there's n-dimensional space-time continua? There are many questions that remain to be solved. What are all the genetic mutations involved in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy? There is so much remaining to be discovered. There's so much we haven't yet done. Einsteinian physics predict that in the space-time continuum, you should be able to travel back in time as a dimension. Have we achieved that yet? No, it remains theoretical. We've just found the Higgs boson, but there's other elementary particles we're looking for that have not yet appeared. And there are many postulates out there for a grand unified theory, and that none yet has been proved. And, it's a matter of opinion which one you like better. The fact that there are these different hypotheses, they presumably aren't all true at once. Do I know how to pick one? No. I'm interested in the outcome. I don't need a belief system to wait for it and to conduct my life until we find out what that grand unified theory is.
This is the inherent problem with a lot of these debates, is that it's like if you define something as mystical and then you want to debate it, you can't, because it's this essence that's mystical, is that it defies logic and defies comprehension. It is a feeling state.
So it's a feeling that, so when you say beyond my comprehension, it's the feeling of being small, of being awestruck, of knowing that there's things that are beyond your ken and that's a beautiful feeling. Is that what you mean?
It can be beautiful. Sometimes it's not.
Let's take a quick look at cults now. Let me ask the question, when does a cult become a religion? And what do you make of some popular religions in the States that began as cults? Do they have the same legitimacy as the big three religions?
Seems to me that the United States is quite a seething cauldron of new religions or cults. And I guess it's sort of in the mind of the beholder. So with the question I guess you're asking us to consider is, when are we just making meaningless noises that indicate a semantic difference, or when are we talking about a real substantive difference between a cult and a religion? From the atheist point of view, they're all cults. It's just some cults have been around longer than others. But that's probably too simplistic, I guess. I guess that's what you're leading at, no? What do you think, Samantha?
I find it tricky, actually, to differentiate between a cult and a religion. I think that my impression is that a lot of religions started off as cults, and part of the difference between a cult and a religion is time and longevity, and then the extent to which the cult ends up breaking from the interests and desires of its leader. Whereas I think a cult tends to be, I've read some interesting sort of descriptions of this, whereas, that a cult tends to be, what they preach tends to be tied up in the self-interest and desires of the leader, rather than some broader principle, let's say. A lot of times in cults, the emphasis is on really active means of suspending critical thinking, like protein deprivation, just to prevent, and some sort of sensory deprivation things to really prevent people from being able to evaluate what's being presented to them. So in that way, I think that cults tend to be often smaller and a little bit more tied up with the leader, whereas religions last longer and aren't necessarily tied in with the leader as much. And, I'm also presenting as though cults are this awful, terrible thing. But frankly, any group, it depends what they do. And if a cult is trying to act for something that is helpful for people and is actually useful and doing good, then I guess it's a good cult.
Well, that's where I think the value issue comes into play. There's always going to be a judgmental side of it. If you have a cult, I think everyone thinks has to be exploitative. It has to be something, there has to be a negative element to it, that this is something that is hurting the participants, where there is a hierarchy. As you say, there's usually an excessive admiration for a certain leader, and people are being duped, and there's the drinking of the Kool-Aid that sometimes happens at the end.
Well, I guess that's the point, is that it seems like, by calling something a cult, it's almost a dirty word. Like, as soon as you call something a cult, then you're saying, when you say religion, it adds a certain credibility, just the term in and of itself. Whereas when you're saying cult, it does have that implication. I agree with you.
So I think it's a continuum. There's this sort of fuzzy threshold where people just have general buy-in. You reach a critical mass, and there's this general consensus of credibility that this group or new identity is legit.
If I reflect upon it, I think I would take the position that between a cult and a religion, you can't blur the lines, and that it's simplistic to say, well, give a cult a century and then it's a religion, because I think cult has more precision. I think it refers specifically to the phenomenon of the con man, or the criminal, or the manipulator, or the psychopath, or the sociopath, take your pick. But hang on, who amasses a group of people, small or large, with nefarious purposes, sort of like Donald Trump. Whereas
so wait,
a religion...
Does that make the United States a cult? Is that what you're trying to say?
In the hands of a cult leader con man, that's for sure. But but there are actual religions out there. I think of the Wiccans, where you have a group that some people might consider cult-like, but where no harm is intended and none is caused to the members or to the leaders. And these are just peaceful people with alternative beliefs that are religion-like, and some people, I think, will improperly call them cult-like. I don't believe in the Wiccans. I don't believe in Wicca. I don't believe in witchcraft, right? But nonetheless, to the extent that they're not harming each other or anybody else, that, for me, that's just a nascent religion. A religion can involve a small number of people. You can't say Judaism has a whole bunch of members on the earth, eh? We got pretty well wiped out with World War II. There's just a few million of us left.
But the expression cult can refer to worship of a figure or a person on earth that is not necessarily a charlatan. I mean, there's the cult of the Virgin Mary, is something that is said often without any sense of derision, just to describe certain cohorts of Roman Catholic, mostly among Roman Catholics, who have a particular veneration for Mother Mary. And there's nothing in that discussion or that label that speaks to her being a charlatan or exploitative. It's just said that there was a particular intensity of worship.
But the word there is used with a completely different meaning. That's misappropriation of the word gang. You can talk about a gang of your friends, and that's not the same as referring to a gang like the Mara Salvatrucha, one of the most notorious gangs on the earth, of the other variety, right? When you talk about the cult of Mary, you simply mean minority or dissentient Catholics who worship Mary more than Jesus Christ or more than the triumvirate. I always thought it was the triumvirate that was important, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But there is nothing, and really at the end of the day, anathema to Catholic theology to put Mary as the Mother of God as your primary figure. And once again, it's still a religion, because these are not believers who are causing harm to each other, nor are they causing harm lately, I suppose, in the name of Mary.
I think the cults that get a lot of attention are the ones that cause harm, that cause really active harm. Those are the ones that are going to hit the newspapers, newspapers, as if anyone reads newspapers now. Sorry.
I do.
The internet.
I do.
Yes. But I don't think nefarious intent or harm is inherent in a cult. I think it can often go along with it. But I was actually, just looking it up in the Oxford Dictionary. What does the Oxford Dictionary define a cult as? A relatively small group of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or as imposing excessive control over members. And I think that I don't think that the line of harm can really be how you divide between a religion and a cult. I think it seems to be more in terms of size of the grouping and acceptance, like how bizarre it seems to our sensibilities. And so I can see quite fathomably how something can start off as a cult where, there may be excessive control over the members and particular rituals that they're engaging in. And it's a small group of people that others may say, perhaps like the, like early Christians that, the Jewish people may say, well, what is this offshoot of Judaism? That's a little bizarre. Who are they following? What are they trying to do over here? I guess they're a cult. But then over time,
we absolutely reject them. Wait a minute, they're heretics.
There are Jews for Jesus.
There are Jews for Jesus. But then over time, once they got enough popularity and once they spread enough, then it started to seem less bizarre because more people accepted them. And then it just,
I used to work with Mike Kropfeld, who had a group, and I probably still has the group called Info Cult, because back in the day, and I don't even remember if you guys were alive, you might have been, or you were, I guess, a lot littler, there was a big movement afoot of rescuing young people who were caught up in cults. I suppose the very concept now is so mainstream that it doesn't even attract media attention the way it once did. And the reason I dealt with him is I had a number of cases where a parent would become involved in a cult, religious or otherwise, and then the children would be mired in that cult. In fact, the case I was involved with recently, that I didn't call Mike into, involved one of the deviant or heretic Orthodox Jewish communities and we know what we're talking about, and I don't want to attract more negative attention to them, and where one of the parents was trying to rescue his children. He and the mother were members of this cult-like group of Orthodox Jews who were so Orthodox. They wouldn't even mix with other Orthodox Jews. They wouldn't educate their children even in Orthodox Jewish schools. And the youth protection got involved so on, and he saved his kids. He had left the cult and took his kids out of the cult, but this woman is still prisoner of the cult because her whole family's in the cult. When I say she's a prisoner in her own mind. And that's why I don't want to banalize the meaning of the word cult, because I think at the end of the day, going past that popular image of drinking the Kool-Aid, which we should never make fun of. We're talking about Jim Jones' cult in Guyana, right? Where over 909 people killed themselves on his command. Kids of your age will use that expression, and you don't have necessarily the experience we have who are older, who lived through that period when we saw people's dead and bloated bodies because they followed this psychotic con man. So when you have a cult leader, you're talking about not just somebody who's pejorative. We're not just using a pejorative term. We're talking about somebody who can cause a huge amount of harm.
I agree with this. Is not to banalize what a cult can be. It's just to say that, and there are a lot of examples that we can pull from of cults that have been extremely harmful, where the leader is very charismatic and manipulative and uses the people in the cult to advance his own personal interests, often to the great detriment of the people in the cult and to their families. And that's terrible, and that's a tragedy. That said, I don't think that's inherent in what a cult is. As with the cult of Mary, you can have cults are what cults do. And so if you have a cult that is, a bit more benign in their interests or acting towards some sort of greater good, then they are to simplify, a good cult. There are a lot of, I think the structure in and of itself lends itself more to abuse. It's easier to be abusive and to be harmful in a cult setting than, let's say, in a religious setting where there's more people to draw on and there's more of a community to draw on, so it's harder to control all of the members. But that said, as the Oxford English Dictionary defines it, it doesn't necessarily have to be evil.
Let me ask on that question: is there a such thing, in your guys' opinion, as a good cult? If someone is devoting a lot of time, not necessarily doing any harm, but also not being particularly productive, can we still consider this person to be doing good, being a good productive person.
Absolutely not. There is absolutely no way. I know there's many flavors and kinds, doomsday cults, racist cults, polygamous cults, white supremacist cults, religious cults, terrorist cults, blah, 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 blah. Even if you take away the pejorative adjectives, by definition, anything that takes a person away from his or her community and family and friends isolates that person by reason of the imposition of a way of thinking, removes that person from the control of the normal governance of civil society. All those attributes, to my mind, are all about brainwashing, isolation, and they're causing harm. And if the only harm that's caused to the individual is to take him away from his job and his family and his friends and an independent way of thinking, for me, that's all the harm in the world.
What if the job and the family and the friends are part of this cult and there was no moving from some other group into this group? I'm thinking of the Hasidic community in particular. And I wondered to myself, what harm are they causing? They grow up in these communities and they have a sense of stability and normalcy in terms of what they've perceived from when they were young. It's not like what you just described, Mom, where it would be, say, like me, like, I don't know, secular basic Daniel being thrust into a Hasidic community and being forced not to speak to, I don't know, non-Jews or
to us heathens?
Yes, to you heathen secular Goldwaters.
Just free Jews.
Right.
Well, I wouldn't go no further than Jewish cuisine to say that you're causing huge harm to poor innocent Jews who don't get to eat all the wonderful foods that we eat because we can eat everything from Vietnamese to Italian.
But they get latkes, and
They get
latkes are delicious.
I'm sure that decrease their life expectancy. But
what a life.
I'm not really trying to be banal because certainly, as you know from me and as you know from your father as a high school teacher who's taught in many sectors has said some of the most brilliant students he's ever met, brilliant in a general way, brilliant in mathematics, have been amongst the Orthodox Jewish community. And so maybe your dad and I come in with more respect for the community than you might experience because we've been there and we've met some absolutely awesome people. And you can't beat Chesky's as a bakery. I have to add that. I mean, I just sort of bash Jewish cuisine, but Jewish pastries, oh my God. But more seriously, I've certainly met enough people, generally the men, interestingly, who have a huge regret that they never had a normal education, that they know nothing about the secular world, that they know nothing about the sciences, about paleontology, about geology, about meteorology, and I don't. And these are not trivial examples of science. They have no real understanding of the physical world or of biology, and it's tragic because it still has enslaved their minds. For all that they're brilliant debaters, I mean, it's a very exceptional form of cult. I love you giving that as an example, in fact, Daniel, because you can't say these minds are imprisoned the same way when some of the most brilliant debaters are from that community.
It's not just that community or that they produce great debaters. You know, I've known some Jehovah's Witnesses, I've known some Mormons, and these are denominations of Christianity that many do regard as cultish and really outside the norm and closed communities and just
but hang on.
Fine people.
Mormonism is accepted as a mainstream faith. At the end of the day, Mormons, after all, as part of their process in growing up, must travel around the world. They must interact with other cultures and other communities. So they're not closed in the way Orthodox Jews or the Amish, for instance, might be closed in. So that's part of the problem.
The Amish also do get to explore the world. Was it Rumspringa? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly.
Yeah, Rumspringa is a very, very short period.
Yes.
Mormons have to be missionaries for a couple of years, and many Mormons marry outside of the community.
Well, I think to put it all together, I think there are a lot of harms that can be inherent that often co-occur with a cult by nature of being small and being fringe and often having a charismatic or authoritarian leader. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that they can, over time, if they get enough credibility and if they expand widely enough and loosen some of the holds, become a religion and then enjoy greater popular support. But I think, again, if I heard somebody... But that said, the bottom line is, if I heard someone tell me that they joined a cult, my first reaction probably wouldn't be, hey, high five, that sounds great. I think my own biases would probably play in pretty strongly, and I would just, look very concerned.
No, they wouldn't call it a cult.
Touche.
But maybe to end it on a positive note, let's have a little humility. But to what extent, anytime you're within your own community and culture, there are always cult-like aspects. You can't expect as a Montreal and a Quebecer ever to disrespect hockey or your local sugar shack. And I don't say that lightly because you could be killed for it. So, there are cult-like aspects to when you have to accept certain of the precepts of the culture you're in. I would never speak to somebody who's a French-speaking person and dare to speak in English. It would be viewed as so rude and inappropriate that my instinct makes me immediately answer in French. I think it's a gesture of respect, personally, but some might say, why do you feel so oppressed that you can't respond in your own language? So, food for thought, no?
Maybe this podcast has cultish aspects. You never know. There are certain sacred cows we can't slay or go to, lest people be disowned and kicked out and tables flipped.
The cult of Goldwater. So now, audience, if you would like to join the cult of Goldwater, then please call. No, I'm just kidding. We're not actually.
I'll end it with Samantha and on positive examples of religion and spirituality. This came up a bit on the happiness episode when we're talking about meditation. But what are some spiritual activities you could say that might actually do some people some good?
I think that there's a lot to be said for ritual and for connection between people. And I think the one thing that is really quite lovely in most religions is that there is, it gives a venue to be able to connect with other people, to be able to join together, to be able to feel like you're part of the same in-group and that you can get support within that group. And a lot of those rituals can be really grounding for people. And when we get to, spiritual practices, oftentimes, when I see clients, before introducing mindfulness, I often ask clients if they pray. And honestly, for clients that pray and that do it regularly, I put that on par with mindfulness as a way to be able to connect with themselves, connect with their sense of the universe, and be able to really ask themselves those difficult questions and get a sense of grounding and connection. So I think that prayer, I think that mindfulness isn't exactly a spiritual practice, but it can be, I think are beautiful things. And then in religion, then there's the ritual, and just being able to be together with other like-minded people can be a very powerful experience.
Let's end with further reading on the topic of religion and spirituality. Daniel, do you want to go first?
I would endorse, I hope this is received the right way, but The Passion, the movie by Mel Gibson. I think it should be seen by anybody, just if you're a film person, but as well as for its theology, its expression of these foundational stories in our culture.
I'm going to recommend the Boomer Bible, A Testament for Our Times by R.F. Laird. And despite what people think, it's more than just a parody of the Bible, but it goes to beliefs, a lot of common beliefs, and treats them with, I guess, a certain irreverence might be the point. I kind of prefer irreverence to reverence. For instance, there are 4 Gospels, Willie, Vinnie, Ned, and Ira. And that's my kind of religious reading.
And I would recommend actually an article on CNN, Why You Don't Need God, by Ryan Bell. And this is a first-person account of a Seventh-day Adventist pastor who was practicing for 19 years, experienced a crisis in his faith and in his belief, and decided to do an experiment and just try to live a year with acting as though he didn't believe in God. And the realizations he comes to really just speak to me. I don't think it's necessarily for everyone, but in reading it, I was just, nodding my head and actually saying yes, under my breath as I was looking through it. It really spoke to how I view atheism. And check it out.
All right, thanks, Goldwaters. Don't forget you can listen to past episodes at thegoldwaters.ca and join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter with the hashtag #TheGoldwaters. Please subscribe on iTunes as well. It's also available on SoundCloud and your favorite podcast platforms. And new this week, we're looking to hear directly from you, the listeners. Drop us an email at talk@thegoldwaters.ca and tell us what you think about this show or others, and we'll use your comments on a future broadcast. I am your moderator, Dan Delmar, and thanks very much for the talk.
Thanks, Dan.
Amen.
Look who's here.
There's Spud, the miracle dog.
Miracle dog.
Hey, Sputnik! Hey, Mr. Spud! Hey, baby! Hey, Miss Munchkin!
Provocateur.media.